Layla had always been a beacon of light in the quiet village that lay at the edge of the forest, where the wind carried the scent of pine and the song of birds wove through the early morning air. Even as a child, she had shown intelligence and kindness beyond her years, tending to the sick, teaching younger children to read, and helping villagers solve disputes with gentle wisdom. Her laughter, soft and musical, would ripple through the streets and alleys, and her eyes, dark and thoughtful, seemed to see beyond the surface of people, understanding both their joys and their unspoken sorrows. In every corner of the village she was beloved, not for her beauty alone, though it was striking, but for the purity of her heart, the sharpness of her mind, and the unyielding kindness she extended to all. Yet home was not a place of warmth and affection. Layla's father had remarried after the death of her mother, and the stepmother who now presided over the household was a woman consumed by envy. The stepmother could not endure the village's admiration for Layla, nor could she tolerate the simple truth that the girl's gentle intelligence and innate charm drew respect and love effortlessly, while she herself had to claw for attention and admiration. Every act of kindness by Layla felt like a slight, every compliment whispered by villagers a dagger aimed at her pride. It was a slow-burning resentment, one that festered and twisted into cruelty over the years. From the moment Layla lost her mother, the stepmother had imposed endless chores upon her, fetching water from the distant well, carrying heavy baskets of firewood through snow and rain, scrubbing floors until her hands bled, cooking meals that were never enough, and tending to the stepmother's whims with unwavering obedience. Each day the girl endured humiliation and verbal abuse, but she bore it silently, her heart refusing to harden despite the cruelty. She had learned to speak carefully, to answer when necessary, but never to complain, never to give the stepmother satisfaction by showing fear. Her quiet resilience became both her shield and her torment. One fateful evening the stepmother's jealousy reached its peak. The girl had returned from helping an elderly villager repair her roof, covered in soot and mud, yet glowing with satisfaction from having done a good deed. The stepmother, seeing her daughter's modest triumph as another act of defiance and superiority, snapped with violent fury. In a moment of rage that froze the household, she seized a sharp, gleaming knife from the kitchen and approached Layla. There was no warning, no time to plead. The blade descended swiftly, and the girl's voice, her laughter, her words, all that had carried her gentle soul, were stolen in an instant. Pain surged through her, blinding and searing, and she fell to the ground, clutching her throat, unable to scream or protest, unable even to weep fully, for the words that should have poured out of her lips were gone. Layla's silence was immediate and absolute. Her eyes, wide and glistening with shock and anguish, sought answers, but the stepmother stood over her with a triumphant sneer, delighted at the girl's sudden powerlessness. The household, long accustomed to the subtle defiance that lingered in Layla's gentle replies, was thrown into stunned quiet. The servants who had witnessed the act dared not speak, their eyes fixed on the stepmother, trembling at the severity of her cruelty. Layla could only stare back, her mind racing faster than her muted tongue could ever manage, her thoughts forming words that would remain trapped within her for the moment, and yet in those thoughts lay a growing ember of determination that would not be extinguished. Despite the terror and pain, Layla's spirit refused to break. Her intelligence, the very quality her stepmother had envied, began to turn inward as she contemplated the strange and cruel world she now faced. She learned to observe more acutely, to sense movements and gestures, to understand the subtleties of language and intention without needing to speak herself. Every glance, every whisper from those around her became amplified in her mind. Though her tongue had been cut, her voice was far from silenced. It would take a new form, one that even the wind might carry, one that would not be contained by mere flesh. Word of the act did not leave the village entirely unnoticed. Though villagers did not know the full horror of the stepmother's crime, they sensed the sudden absence of Layla's gentle voice in the home. They missed her guidance, her laughter, and her presence in the streets and gardens. Her absence in conversation was like a missing melody, and those who had relied on her counsel began to feel a subtle void, a strange unease that hinted at the cruelty she had endured. And though the stepmother sought to terrify the girl into submission, Layla's silence became the first step in a transformation, one that would eventually turn pain into power, oppression into influence, and the stolen words into a voice that could not be contained by any human hand. In that night of darkness and cruelty, as the wind rustled through the trees outside and the house seemed to hold its breath, Layla's eyes reflected sorrow, intelligence, and a spark of defiance that would grow into legend. Though her tongue was gone, her spirit remained intact, vibrant and watchful, ready to find new ways to speak, to protect, and to influence the world around her. In that moment, the girl who could no longer utter a sound became far more than a helpless victim. She became the seed of a story that the wind itself would one day carry through storms, across villages and into eternity. Life in the household became a relentless cycle of labor and humiliation for Layla. From dawn until long after the sun had disappeared behind the distant hills, she was forced to obey the whims of her cruel stepmother, who had assumed total control over the house and its daily rhythm. Every task, no matter how menial, was demanded with the weight of tyranny, and every mistake, no matter how slight, was met with sharp words, scornful glares, or cruel punishment. Layla's hands were constantly raw from scrubbing floors, washing endless piles of laundry in the frigid water, and cooking meals that were neither enough to satisfy the stepmother's greed nor comforting to anyone else. The girl moved with silent efficiency, her body weary, but her mind alert, always measuring the stepmother's moods, anticipating the next command, the next possible attack. The stepmother took particular delight in humiliation. She would call Layla before the household staff and mock her appearance, her intelligence, and her gentle nature, comparing her unfavorably to imagined ideals and exalting her own superficial accomplishments. At mealtime, she would make Layla serve the most meager portions while taking the finest dishes for herself, speaking loudly of the girl's incompetence as if the servants were witnesses to a performance of shame. The stepmother's cruelty extended beyond physical or verbal abuse. She orchestrated situations in which Layla's dignity was systematically eroded, ensuring that no one could witness her suffer without sensing the powerlessness that had been forced upon her. Layla's father, preoccupied with distant business affairs or perhaps willfully blind to the cruelty in his household, offered no protection. His absence or impotence left her isolated, with no ally in the very place that should have been a sanctuary. The walls of her home, once filled with laughter and warmth, had become prisons of quiet terror, enclosing a girl who could no longer speak her sorrow aloud. The isolation was almost complete, leaving Layla to navigate the daily torment on her own, relying on her intelligence and inner strength to endure the harshness of the stepmother's rule. Outside the house, villagers began to notice changes. Layla's absence from her usual tasks in the community, the sudden disappearance of her gentle guidance, and her increasingly withdrawn demeanor did not go unnoticed. Children who once played at her feet now whispered about her in confusion, and neighbors sensed a shadow over the once bright girl. Some tried to intervene, offering small gestures of kindness, a bowl of food left on the doorstep, or quiet words of encouragement when she passed by. Yet, none dared confront the stepmother directly for fear of reprisal. The villagers understood Layla's suffering but felt powerless to aid her in a world dominated by a woman who ruled her home with cruelty and manipulation. Despite the isolation and oppression, Layla's spirit remained resilient. She learned to observe quietly, understanding the moods and patterns of her stepmother, anticipating moments of danger, and silently planning ways to protect herself. Every humiliation, every harsh command, and every act of cruelty was absorbed not just as pain, but as fuel for her growing inner strength. She discovered that even in silence she could assert a subtle kind of power, through observation, patience, and the careful management of her thoughts and actions. Though her tongue had been stolen, Layla's mind remained sharp, and her resolve continued to grow with each passing day. The stepmother ruled the household with brute force, but she could not touch the parts of Layla that mattered most: her intelligence, her will, and her capacity to endure. In the quiet corners of the home, behind closed doors, and in the small acts of resilience, the girl began to nurture a seed of defiance that no cruelty could extinguish, a seed that would one day allow her words, carried by the wind, to reach far beyond the walls that sought to contain her. The evening arrived heavy with clouds, the sky darkening with the promise of a storm that would sweep across the village like a restless spirit. Layla, confined to her room by her stepmother's cruel vigilance, sat by the small window, her hands resting on the sill, watching the first drops of rain streak the glass. The world outside seemed to mirror her own turmoil. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches, and the leaves danced violently in the sudden gusts. For the first time since her tongue had been stolen, Layla felt a strange connection to the elements, as if the storm itself mirrored the pain and sorrow that filled her heart. As the rain intensified, the wind began to carry sounds that were unfamiliar, almost ethereal. Villagers who had taken shelter in their homes paused mid-task, ears straining. There was a whispering in the gusts, soft at first as if the wind were testing the world, speaking in a language that no human had ever learned. The voices twisted through the trees, along the riverbank, and into the narrow streets, sorrowful, haunting, and strangely insistent. People turned toward the source, attempting to understand, yet the words eluded comprehension, like fragments of a story just out of reach. The whispers carried the weight of grief, longing, and quiet defiance, touching hearts in ways that neither logic nor sight could explain. Inside her room, Layla felt the wind respond to her thoughts. She concentrated, thinking of her suffering, of the injustice inflicted by her stepmother, and a tremor ran through the storm outside. Leaves swirled more violently, rain streaked at sharper angles, and the whispers grew slightly clearer, like echoes of her unspoken words. Though she could not speak aloud, her spirit felt unbound, stretching into the night, finding a voice in the storm itself. Each thought, each yearning, seemed to ripple through the gale, carried invisibly across the village, touching those who were open and sensitive enough to feel it. The villagers could not understand the whispers, yet they felt their sorrow and urgency as if the wind itself were speaking to their hearts. Some shivered with unease, believing the storm to be an omen. Others felt an inexplicable sadness, a mingling of empathy and curiosity for the unseen presence that seemed to permeate the wind. Animals fled to shelter, sensing the change in the air, while the village fires flickered as if responding to the invisible energy that swirled around the homes. Even the bravest adults felt a shiver of awe, realizing that this storm was unlike any other, carrying a presence that was unseen yet undeniably alive. Within the household, the stepmother cowered slightly at the intensity of the storm. Though she could not articulate the fear she felt, a deep, instinctive dread gripped her. Something beyond her understanding had been awakened in her stepdaughter. Layla, silent but unbroken, was no longer confined to the muted existence that her tongue's removal had imposed. Her spirit had found a conduit in the storm, a way to reach beyond the walls of the house, to touch the village in ways that defied the stepmother's control. By the time dawn began to break, the storm had passed, leaving the village damp and trembling, with trees bent and leaves scattered across the streets. Villagers whispered to one another about the strange voices they had heard, unable to place them yet unable to forget the haunting sorrow that lingered in their hearts. They would carry the memory of that first storm with them, unaware that it was the silent voice of Layla speaking through the wind. Within her room, Layla gazed out at the quieting world, a spark of hope and determination igniting in her chest. Though she could not speak aloud, her words had reached others, even if they did not understand, and she felt for the first time that her voice could never truly be silenced. The days after the first storm brought a strange mix of fear and wonder to the village. The elders spoke quietly among themselves about the night when the wind had whispered sorrowful words that no one could understand yet could not forget. Children looked up at the skies with wide, questioning eyes whenever clouds gathered, sensing that something unseen was watching over them. For Layla, confined to her room, the discovery of her new voice came gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremors before a quake. She realized that though her tongue had been cut and her speech silenced, the storms carried her thoughts, her words, and the quiet urgings of her heart. At first it was subtle. She would think of a neighbor who needed help, and the wind would shift just so, bending branches to knock a basket of fruit down from a tree, delivering it to the doorstep of the poor widow who could not afford to buy food that week. Or she would imagine a stray child wandering near the riverbank, and a sudden gust would push the small figure back to safety, unseen hands guiding the helpless through the danger. With each attempt, she learned how to direct the wind, how to shape her thoughts into small currents that could bend objects, sway branches, and carry meaning in ways that transcended words. The villagers began to notice these strange occurrences with a mix of awe and unease. A baker found a warning in a cascade of falling leaves that prevented his cart from rolling into the river. A farmer discovered that a sudden, precise gust of wind had shielded his young son from a collapsing fence. None could explain the cause, and yet each felt the touch of something otherworldly. The wind itself seemed alive, guided by a presence that was gentle, intelligent, and attentive. Those who were open of heart felt the subtle nudges of this invisible hand, while those who acted with selfishness or malice found themselves thwarted by unseen forces. Inside her room, Layla experimented with her newfound power. She concentrated on the direction of her thoughts, envisioning a message traveling through the air to someone in need. With a deep focus, she would imagine the path the wind would take, the gestures it would carry, and the outcome she wished to see. Sometimes, a flicker of light on a window pane or the sudden rattle of a door signaled that her message had been received, even if the recipient did not fully understand its origin. She began to sense a rhythm, a language of the wind that responded to emotion and intent rather than speech. Her voice, though no longer bound to words or syllables, had become more powerful than she could have imagined. The stepmother remained oblivious to the growing influence of the girl she sought to destroy. She barked orders and demanded obedience, yet the wind moved around her commands, protecting the innocent and guiding the vulnerable, ensuring that the household and the village alike remained safe from harm. Layla's power was subtle, indirect, and entirely beyond the stepmother's comprehension. The wind became both her shield and her messenger, carrying her voice through storms and gusts to reach those who were willing to listen, even if only with their hearts. The villagers began to associate sudden breezes, rustling leaves, and shifting branches with more than weather. They sensed guidance, protection, and warnings in the patterns of the wind, though they did not yet know the source. Layla, though still trapped in silence, realized that her words now had a reach far greater than any spoken voice could have provided. She was no longer confined by the walls of her home or the cruelty of her stepmother. The wind was her ally, her messenger, and the vessel through which she could continue to influence the world. By the end of each storm, Layla felt a growing sense of purpose and liberation. Though her tongue was cut and her voice silenced, her thoughts and intentions traveled freely through the village, carried by the wind, touching lives in ways that words alone never could. Each gust, each rustling leaf, and each sudden, precise movement of objects was a testament to the fact that true voice, true influence, could not be restrained by cruelty, pain, or fear. Through the wind, Layla had found her freedom. The wind had become more than a messenger. It had grown into a vigilant guardian of the village, carrying Layla's presence invisibly through every alley, field, and rooftop. Her thoughts, now refined and deliberate, were no longer simply expressions of sorrow. They had transformed into deliberate warnings, small acts of protection for those around her. Each storm, each gust of wind, became a conduit through which she could intervene in the lives of the villagers, preventing accidents and guiding the innocent away from harm. One afternoon, a group of children played near the ancient oak that stood at the edge of the village square. They laughed and chased one another, unaware of the branch above that had been weakened by recent rains. A sudden sharp gust of wind shook the tree violently, scattering leaves and startling the children just as the branch began to crack. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by startled shrieks as they scrambled back, narrowly avoiding injury. The villagers who witnessed the scene murmured among themselves, puzzled by the uncanny timing of the wind, unable to explain how such a disaster had been averted. Similarly, when a wolf ventured close to the livestock at the northern edge of the village, the wind twisted and turned, rustling branches and snapping small twigs, creating an eerie barrier that seemed to herd the predator away from the pens. The shepherds, sensing the urgency in the unusual wind patterns, quickly guided the sheep to safety, unaware that it was Layla's spirit orchestrating every movement. Each act of protection was subtle but unmistakable to those with a keen eye, a pattern of guidance woven into the natural elements that could not be ignored. Even fires, which could sweep through dry thatch-roofed homes with terrifying speed, were sometimes intercepted. A sudden gust would shift a smoldering ember away from the rooftops, or redirect a spark from the village bakery before it could ignite the dry beams above. The villagers noticed these inexplicable occurrences and began to speak in hushed tones of the unseen protector whose guidance seemed to come from the air itself. Though none fully understood the source, they began to sense a presence both benevolent and intelligent, a silent guardian watching over them. For a select few, those who possessed an open heart and a sensitivity to the mystical currents of the world, the messages were clearer still. The wind would brush against their cheeks in gentle nudges, rustle the pages of a book that contained advice, or sway the branches to point the way to a path of caution. These subtle communications allowed Layla to guide her people in more deliberate ways, ensuring that her warnings were heeded even without her spoken voice. Children learned to trust the sudden gusts, elders learned to interpret unusual patterns in the air, and the villagers as a whole gradually began to rely on this mysterious guidance as part of their daily lives. Layla's influence through the wind grew steadily, though it remained invisible. Her stepmother remained unaware of the transformation, believing that her control over the household and the girl was absolute. Yet Layla's silent intervention showed that true power was not always visible, and that the most profound acts of protection could be carried out without confrontation or recognition. The villagers, though they did not know Layla's identity at first, began to respect the wind as more than a natural force, recognizing it as a messenger of wisdom, care, and vigilance. By the time night fell and the village lay quiet under the soft glow of lanterns, the impact of Layla's whispered warnings could be felt throughout every home. Crops had been safeguarded, children had returned unharmed from risky play, and fires that might have claimed homes had been redirected or subdued. Though she could not speak aloud, Layla had become an invisible protector, her presence felt in every breeze, every rustle, and every subtle movement of the elements. The villagers, touched and guided by this unseen force, were beginning to learn a lesson that would endure long after the storms passed. Even in silence, a voice born of courage and care could shape the world and protect those who could not protect themselves. At first, the stepmother dismissed the unusual occurrences in the village as mere coincidence, the work of chance and wind. Yet, as days turned into weeks and storms continued to carry warnings that seemed to protect the villagers from harm, she could no longer ignore the truth. The wind moved with uncanny precision, guiding children away from danger, redirecting animals, and even preventing small fires from spreading. The stepmother's initial pride in controlling the household and the girl herself began to dissolve into a creeping unease, a feeling that some unseen force was undermining her authority. Every time the wind seemed to act with purpose, the stepmother's envy twisted into fear. She observed the villagers talking in hushed tones about mysterious guidance, their eyes wide with awe or unease, their gestures acknowledging the invisible protector. The realization that Layla's influence extended beyond the walls of their home struck her like a blow. It was not only the girl's beauty or cleverness that had survived her cruelty, but something far greater, something intangible, powerful, and beyond her control. Every gust, every rustle of leaves, and every sudden, inexplicable movement in the village reminded the stepmother that the child she had sought to silence was not defeated. Her dreams became restless and haunted by the echoes of the wind. She would wake in the dead of night to the sound of whispers carried through her chamber, too faint to understand, yet sharp enough to prick at her nerves and ignite a simmering panic. Shadows danced in corners where no light should fall, and the small signs of Layla's influence appeared everywhere, subtle yet undeniable. The stepmother's confidence, once hard and unyielding, began to crack, leaving her grasping for control in a world that was increasingly slipping from her reach. In public, she attempted to maintain her authority, raising her voice in commands and asserting her dominance over servants and neighbors alike. Yet the villagers, aware of the mysterious events, began to avoid her eyes, wary of angering the unseen presence that seemed to protect Layla. Even her words, meant to intimidate and belittle, fell flat. Her power, so carefully cultivated over the years, was no match for the silent strength of the girl she had tried to destroy. The stepmother began to tremble at the thought that her schemes could be thwarted by forces she could not perceive, that her cruelty might ultimately fail against the resilience of the child she had sought to dominate. As storms continued to rise and fall over the village, each one carrying the whispers of Layla's unspoken words, the stepmother's dread deepened. Envy, which had once fueled her cruelty, now fueled her terror. She had sought to silence Layla completely, to erase her presence and claim victory over her spirit, but in doing so, she had unleashed something she could not contain. Every gust of wind, every carefully timed warning that saved a life or prevented disaster, served as a reminder of her impotence. The realization settled heavily upon her. Layla's words could not be silenced, her spirit could not be broken, and her influence reached far beyond the walls of the home. The stepmother, once confident in her dominion, now trembled in fear, understanding that the girl she had tried to destroy had grown into a power she could neither grasp nor oppose. Envy had been replaced by dread, a cold awareness that no cruelty, no matter how severe, could extinguish a voice carried by the wind, a voice that now whispered through every storm with quiet, unstoppable determination. The villagers could no longer ignore the strange patterns that accompanied every storm, nor the subtle guidance carried by the restless winds. At first, they spoke in whispers among themselves, attributing the uncanny events to chance or superstition. Yet as the days passed, it became impossible to dismiss the persistent protection and warnings that seemed to follow them through rain, wind, and sudden gusts. Children were led away from danger before an accident could occur. Fires that threatened to consume homes were deflected as if by an invisible hand. Lost animals returned to their owners guided by inexplicable currents of air. The villagers, awed and unsettled, began to sense a presence far greater than any human force. Elders, the keepers of the village's oral histories, attempted to decipher these mysterious messages. They listened intently to the rustle of leaves, the way the wind bent through narrow alleys, the subtle vibrations that carried across rooftops. They recorded what they could, shared observations with one another, and speculated on the source. Though the words themselves remained indecipherable, the intent behind them was clear. Someone or something was watching over the village, guiding them and preventing harm. The elders' curiosity evolved into reverence, their fear tempered by the recognition of an intelligence far beyond ordinary comprehension. Children, too, were captivated. They would play near windows or in open fields during storms, eyes bright with wonder, feeling the wind brush against their cheeks as if communicating secret truths. They began to anticipate the guidance, following sudden gusts or avoiding areas the wind seemed to nudge them away from. Though they did not understand the mechanics, they learned to trust the invisible force, instinctively aligning their actions with the protective currents. Among the villagers, this behavior sparked stories and speculation, creating a quiet fascination with the girl who could influence the storm itself. Some of the more perceptive villagers began to connect these events to Layla, the silent girl confined to her home. They remembered her gentle nature, her intelligence, and the way she had always cared for the community despite her youth. Slowly, a new respect emerged. Layla was no longer just a child in the village, she had become a guiding presence, a protector whose influence reached beyond the boundaries of speech or flesh. People spoke of her in hushed tones, acknowledging that her silence did not diminish her strength, it enhanced it, lending her a mystical quality that filled the imagination of all who encountered the wind's whispers. Curiosity mingled with awe, and even those who were skeptical found themselves compelled to observe and respect the unseen force at work. Farmers paused to notice how the wind shifted in patterns that saved crops from heavy rainfall. Villagers on the roads felt nudges that led them safely past hazards. The patterns repeated in subtle but undeniable ways, creating a sense of order and protection that could not be attributed to chance. The more the villagers tried to understand, the more they sensed the depth of Layla's power, realizing that intelligence and care could manifest in forms that were invisible yet profoundly real. The stepmother, observing from within her home, watched with growing unease as the villagers' curiosity evolved into admiration. Her attempts to intimidate and control Layla had failed utterly. The girl's influence had grown far beyond her walls, beyond her grasp. The village had become attuned to the silent guidance, learning to follow it, trust it, and respect it. The storms no longer brought fear alone. They carried lessons, warnings, and the subtle presence of a girl whose words could not be silenced, whose spirit had become inseparable from the winds themselves. By the time the sun set after another stormy day, the villagers were left with a sense of reverence and wonder. Layla, though still silent, had transformed in their eyes from a girl of quiet suffering to a guardian whose presence permeated the village, guiding their steps and protecting their lives in ways they could neither fully comprehend nor ignore. They had begun to understand that true strength often lies in subtlety, in persistence, and in the unseen ways one can shape the world. Layla's influence through the wind grew more deliberate with each passing day, as she discovered not only the ability to protect but also to encourage acts of goodness and harmony within the village. She had learned how to guide the currents, to subtly alter their course, to send small nudges and reminders to those who were willing to listen. The wind became her instrument, carrying her silent intentions to help, to teach, and to reward, without ever requiring a spoken word. It began with small interventions. A heated argument between neighbors over a shared water source would be interrupted by a sudden gust that scattered their tools or rustled the leaves around them, forcing them to pause. The momentary distraction allowed tempers to cool, and in the quiet that followed, they found themselves reconsidering harsh words, finding compromise in ways that had seemed impossible moments before. Layla's wind-mediated guidance did not dictate outcomes, but it created space for reflection, nudging hearts toward understanding rather than conflict. Farmers working in the fields were subtly steered to notice problems before they became disasters. A weak fence on the edge of a pasture would be pushed just enough by a playful wind to reveal its flaw before livestock could escape. Children walking home from school would feel gentle nudges guiding them away from puddles or slipping paths after rain. Small acts, almost imperceptible, multiplied across the village into a network of protection and positive influence. The villagers began to sense patterns in the natural world, as if the elements themselves were alive, watching and responding to their actions. Kindness, Layla discovered, could also be rewarded. A villager who secretly left extra firewood for a struggling family might find a sudden breeze toppling a ripe branch full of fruit near their doorstep, or a hidden basket of fresh vegetables pushed along the path to meet their steps. She reinforced the idea that good deeds carried their own reward, amplifying their effects through the unseen currents that moved invisibly yet powerfully. In this way, the wind became a silent teacher, encouraging empathy, generosity, and vigilance. At times, Layla would orchestrate more complex guidance. When two villagers planned a market project that risked failure due to overlooked hazards, a sequence of gusts, rustling leaves, and gentle knocks on windows led them to reconsider key details. By subtly steering attention to overlooked areas, she ensured that collaborative efforts succeeded, reinforcing trust and cooperation within the community. Each time her interventions were effective, the villagers could not explain why things seemed to unfold favorably, yet the pattern of protection and guidance became increasingly clear. Even the smallest moments carried the touch of Layla's presence. A child who dropped a precious toy near the riverbank would feel a gentle gust push it back to their hands. An elderly woman, stumbling on a slippery path, would be steadied by the wind in a subtle, almost miraculous way. The villagers grew attuned to these interactions, feeling a mix of awe and comfort, a recognition that the unseen forces around them were not only protective but guided by a consciousness of remarkable intelligence and care. Through all of these acts, Layla's spirit remained unseen, her voice silent, yet her influence unmistakable. The stepmother, still unaware of the depth of the girl's power, could not comprehend how the village seemed increasingly aligned with Layla's unseen guidance. Each storm, each gust, and each subtle movement of the wind reinforced her presence, demonstrating that true influence required neither threat nor speech, only vision, intelligence, and a heart attuned to the welfare of others. In this way, Layla transformed from a silent victim into a quiet force for good, her lessons carried by the wind, shaping the village, protecting its people, and inspiring kindness in ways that words alone could never achieve. The stepmother's cruelty, once measured and subtle, escalated into frantic, desperate attempts to regain control over Layla and the household. Every day brought new schemes, devised with cunning precision and fueled by envy and rage. She attempted to confine Layla further, assigning impossible tasks that would leave her exhausted and broken. She plotted to humiliate her in front of the villagers, hoping to remind everyone of her supposed authority and the girl's helplessness. She believed that if she could manipulate the physical world around Layla, she could finally suppress the invisible influence that had begun to disrupt her carefully controlled household. But with every plan, the wind intervened, carrying Layla's silent warnings and protections in ways the stepmother could neither see nor anticipate. When she tried to lead the girl into a trap, a sudden gust of wind scattered her carefully laid obstacles, revealing the scheme before it could take effect. When she attempted to humiliate Layla publicly, the winds whispered warnings that guided villagers to act differently, inadvertently exposing the stepmother's cruelty to all who witnessed it. Every act of malice, intended to reinforce her control, became a vehicle for her own humiliation, her intentions unraveling in the presence of Layla's mystical guardianship. The stepmother's fear deepened with each failed scheme. She could feel the wind's presence almost like a living entity, bending and twisting around her, reacting to Layla's thoughts, undoing her plans before they could even be set into motion. She attempted to speak with authority, to intimidate the servants, to demand obedience from the villagers, but every word fell flat, countered by the subtle interventions of the unseen force. Firewood she stacked would topple at the wrong moment, water would spill in inconvenient ways, and even doors would creak open at precisely the wrong time. The stepmother found herself ensnared in a web of her own making, each strand subtly manipulated by a power she could not comprehend. Humiliation began to eat at her pride. Servants and villagers, once fearful of the stepmother, now began to question her authority as the pattern of the wind's interventions became undeniable. Whispers of Layla's influence spread through the village, carried by awe and curiosity, and soon even the most skeptical recognized that something beyond ordinary human understanding was at work. The stepmother, once a figure of absolute control, was now reduced to a woman trembling in uncertainty, unable to predict, prevent, or dominate. Every thwarted plan strengthened Layla's mystical influence. The villagers began to sense her presence not as a passive force but as a vigilant protector. They saw the precision of the wind's timing, the subtle corrections to potential disaster, and the way small injustices were quietly righted. Even without understanding the source, they began to revere the invisible guardian whose guidance had become integral to their lives. Layla's voice, carried by the elements, grew louder in effect even as it remained silent in form. By the time another storm swept over the village, the stepmother's desperation had reached its peak. She lashed out in panic, demanding obedience, threatening punishment, and attempting to assert dominance over the girl she could no longer control. But the winds, now attuned to Layla's thoughts and intentions, responded with unwavering precision. Branches bent to protect the innocent, pathways shifted to guide the wary, and small obstacles revealed the stepmother's cruelty to all who witnessed her failing plots. Each failure, each act of exposure, left her weaker, more humiliated, and increasingly aware that she was powerless against a force far beyond her understanding. Layla, though still silent, watched the unraveling from her room. Every gust that carried her warnings, every intervention that thwarted her stepmother's cruelty, strengthened her presence in the village. Her mystical influence had grown undeniable, transforming fear and envy into lessons of humility, patience, and resilience. In the invisible currents of the wind, she had become unstoppable, a force whose words, though unheard, reshaped the lives of all who lived under her watchful protection. The sky darkened as though it were mourning the injustices that had been carried out in secret for far too long. Clouds rolled in thick and heavy, blocking out the sun and casting the village in a dim, restless twilight. The air trembled with anticipation, and the first sharp gusts of wind rattled doors and windows as the villagers scurried to secure their homes. This storm, unlike any before it, carried a sense of purpose, as if the heavens themselves had aligned to reveal truths long hidden. As the winds intensified, they moved with deliberate intent, rustling trees in rhythmic patterns, whipping through alleys and swirling around the edges of the village square. Children paused in awe, sensing something alive in the air, a consciousness that felt both gentle and commanding. Animals, usually skittish during storms, seemed to move in accordance with the invisible force, avoiding danger with uncanny precision. Every gust, every whistling sound, every bend of a branch felt orchestrated, purposeful, and deliberate. Through the chaos of rain and wind, Layla's unspoken words traveled farther and clearer than ever before. Her thoughts of suffering, injustice, and longing for acknowledgement were carried on the storm's currents. The villagers, caught in the storm's fury yet attentive to its patterns, began to perceive the whispers that threaded through the gusts. Though still incomprehensible in literal language, the emotions behind the wind were unmistakable: sorrow, defiance, courage, and an unyielding call for justice. Mothers clutched their children a little closer, elders paused their hurried tasks to listen, and even skeptical villagers could not ignore the force that seemed to speak directly to their hearts. The storm revealed small, poignant acts simultaneously: a branch diverted to prevent a child from tripping into a muddy ditch, a basket of spilled grain guided safely to the farmer's doorstep, and a small fire in a kitchen extinguished by a sudden, precise puff of wind. The villagers began to understand that these interventions were not random. They were messages of protection and guidance, proof of an intelligence that could not be seen but was deeply felt. The connections between Layla's silent suffering and the storm's purposeful actions became clear, and a wave of empathy and recognition swept through the community. For the first time, the villagers fully grasped the injustice Layla had endured at the hands of her stepmother. Her tongue had been cruelly cut, her voice silenced, yet she had found a way to speak through the forces of nature. The wind had become her medium, her voice, and now, under the full power of the storm, the village witnessed her resilience and strength in their entirety. Fear and confusion gave way to awe, respect, and a deep sense of reverence. People who had once ignored her suffering now bowed their heads in acknowledgement of her courage, recognizing the mystical presence that had guided, protected, and corrected them over countless days. Even the stepmother, trapped in her own home and trembling with fear, could no longer deny the truth. The storm exposed her cruelty and her impotence, and the villagers' recognition of Layla's spirit left her isolated in shame. The wind swirled around her, carrying the silent defiance and justice of Layla, a reminder that no act of oppression, no cruelty, no envy, could suppress a spirit guided by truth and courage. By the storm's end, the village stood transformed. Layla, though still confined to her room and silent in speech, had become a living force, her voice inseparable from the winds that had carried her words. The storm of revelation left no doubt. Her suffering had been real, her resilience unmatched, and her spirit, though unseen, could be felt in every gust, every rustling leaf, and every protective movement through the village. The people now understood that her voice had never been lost. It had only changed its form, becoming a force of nature that no one could ignore. The storm's revelation left the village forever changed. The truth of Layla's suffering could no longer be denied, and the people's eyes were open to the cruelty that had been hidden behind the stepmother's harsh words and oppressive control. Villagers, once hesitant or silent, now spoke openly about what they had witnessed, both Layla's unjust treatment and the mystical interventions that had protected them. The stepmother, whose power had seemed absolute for so long, now faced the weight of communal judgment and supernatural recognition. The elders called for a gathering in the village square, a council to address the wrongs that had been done. They recounted the events, the strange gusts that had saved children from harm, the whispers that guided farmers and shepherds, and the inexplicable acts of protection that had occurred time and again. The villagers, inspired by the evidence of Layla's unseen influence, demanded justice. Some called for social accountability, insisting that the stepmother be publicly shamed and made to atone for her cruelty. Others invoked the supernatural, acknowledging that the wind itself seemed aligned with Layla's spirit, ensuring that no harm could come to her without consequences. The stepmother, confronted by the collective gaze of the village and the undeniable presence of Layla's power, could no longer hide behind intimidation or deceit. Her schemes had unraveled, her authority had been exposed as false, and every attempt to manipulate or frighten had failed spectacularly. Fear and humiliation overtook her, leaving her isolated and powerless. Even as she attempted to speak, her voice seemed swallowed by the very winds that had carried Layla's words, as though nature itself had turned against her. The villagers, sensing this alignment of justice, made clear that her position of control was at an end. Layla, though still unable to speak, emerged as the true figure of authority and reverence. Her resilience, patience, and courage had not only protected the village but had also reshaped its understanding of power and justice. The villagers now saw her as a guiding presence, her influence extending far beyond the walls of her home. Each gust of wind, each subtle intervention, had become a lesson in empathy, courage, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Her silence, once imposed by cruelty, had become a symbol of unwavering determination and mystical potency. Over time, the stepmother's punishments were carried out in multiple ways. Socially, she faced the judgment and reproach of her peers, who no longer tolerated her cruelty or false authority. Supernaturally, the winds seemed to continue their quiet vigilance, subtly reminding her that any further malice would meet resistance. Layla, meanwhile, gained not only safety but also respect and dignity, her presence now honored throughout the village. Neighbors sought her guidance, children looked to her example, and even the stepmother, now subdued and powerless, could not ignore the extraordinary force of her resilience. In her home, Layla finally experienced a sense of peace. Tasks that had once been imposed as punishment were now shared fairly among the household, and her voice, though still carried silently through the wind, resonated in the hearts of those who had witnessed her trials and triumphs. The village, inspired by her courage and guided by her mystical presence, learned that true justice is not always immediate, but when it aligns with integrity and persistence, it becomes undeniable. Layla's enduring strength had transformed suffering into empowerment, cruelty into revelation, and silence into a voice that no one could ignore.